Hello. I've decided to record my Rosh HaShanah Shiur this year, as well as delivering it live on the first day of Rosh HaShanah. If you are planning to come to Shiur on the first day of Rosh HaShanah, then please don't watch this until after Yom Tov and join me live instead. There is a source sheet provided, which you can download from my website. That's rabbibelovski.com. This year's Rosh HaShanah Shiur is entitled When Rosh HaShanah Falls on Shabbos, Zichron Teruah, a remembrance of the Teruah, of the blowing. This year, 2020, for the first time since 2009, Rosh HaShanah falls on Shabbos and Sunday. And that means there will be no shofar on the first day, only on the second day. And although this is a subject which we've explored before, it was so long ago that it deserves a re-examination. And so I'm going to look at the origins of the practice of not blowing shofar on Rosh HaShanah when it falls on Shabbos, how that evolved, and some quite surprising difference of opinions. Source 1 is a Gemara, the beginning of the final chapter of Rosh HaShanah, starting on Kaf Tes on the base 29b in Tractate Rosh HaShanah, addresses this question. And there's a very, very long sugya that follows. This is quite long, but it's only a part of it. I've culled it. It's relatively easy, and I will go through it quite quickly. And this gives the background. So the Mishnah, Yom Tov Shel Rosh HaShanah Shechal Yos B'Shabbos, when the festival of Rosh HaShanah coincides with Shabbos, like this year, but Mikdash Hayatokin, they would blow the shofar in the Mikdash, in the temple, Avol Lo Medina, but not literally in the state. Now there is a disagreement between the Rambam and the other Rishonim as to the definitions here, but suffice it to say, they would blow in the temple and perhaps in Jerusalem, and not outside. There's a disagreement as to the exact definition of Medina, but it's not germane here. Mishacharav Beis HaMikdash, after the temple was destroyed, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the architect of post-destruction Judaism. He is the one who negotiated with Vespasian in a Gemara in Gittin, and he is responsible for quite a number of particular takonas, enactments, to preserve and protect Judaism in the post-temple era. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted Shetokin b'chol mokum sheyesh bo beis din, that they would blow the shofar, that means when it fell on Shabbos, in everywhere where there is a beis din, i.e. not just in the temple. Omer Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar disagrees with the first presentation of the parameters of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling. Lo hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, ela b'Yavne bilvad. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not extend this permission to everywhere where there was a beis din, only to Yavne. Now, sometime before the destruction, the Sanhedrin decamped to Yavne, which became the seat of Jewish learning and Jewish teaching. And according to Rabbi Elazar, the rule that you could blow the shofar in the beis din outside of the temple only applied to Yavne. Omrulai, no. The other rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Elazar. Echad Yavne, the echad kol mokum sheyesh bo beis din. No, it applied to both Yavne and anywhere where there was a beis din. For the sake of completeness, I'm going to read the rest of the Mishnah, although we're not going to explore this part when we read the Gemara. And in this respect, Yerushalayim was also superior to Yavne. Shekol ir shehi oroi v'shoma'as v'karov v'yochol lovoi, because any city, a village, which could see or hear and was close enough that one could come on Yom Tov to Yerushalayim, toikin, they could blow too. They had an extended rule, as it were. Yerushalayim was extended to them. This is in the post-temple era. Remember, during the temple era, they only blew in the Mikdash. Ubi Yavne, but in Yavne, lo token el beis din bilvad. But when it was extended to Yavne, they only blew the shofar in the beis din. That's the Mishnah. The critical part of the Gemara is really the first paragraph. Gemara, it's the second section of source 1. Minahani mili. How do we know this? How do we know that when Rosh HaShanah falls on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar? Except in very specific circumstances. Omer Rebbe Levi bar Lachma, Omer Rebbe Chama bar Chanina. Now, if you're familiar with the references to Rosh HaShanah in the Torah, it appears first in one verse, Kosov Echod Omer, one verse says in Parshas Emor, Shabbosoin Zichron Teruah. The Yom Tov is described as Shabboson, which means, that's the word we use for Shabbaton today, but it means a festival, which is Zichron Teruah, which recalls the Teruah. And the other verse says, and this is in Bamidbar, and we read it on Rosh HaShanah as the Maftir from the second Sefer Torah, Yom Teruah Yelochem, it shall be a day of blowing for you. They seem to conflict. One says it's a day of blowing, one says it's a remembrance of blowing. Lo kasha, there's no contradiction. Come b'yom tov shechal liyos b'Shabbos. The first zichron, when you only remember the teruah, that's when Yom Tov falls on Shabbos. Come, but when it says Yom Tov, a day of actual blowing, b'yom tov shechal liyos b'chol, that's when Yom Tov falls on a weekday. So the Gemara's first attempt, from Rabbi Levi bar Lachma in the name of Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, is the Torah itself regulates this. The Torah has two phrases for Rosh HaShanah. One means blow, one says remember blowing. One says talk about blowing, one says actually blow. How so? One Shabbos, one weekday. But that doesn't really work. Omer Rava attacks this. Imedu Raisahi, but Midrash Heichen Token, if you're right that this is a biblical construct, what could justify blowing the shofar in the temple when it fell on Shabbos? You just never do it. Va'oid, and furthermore, Halav Melochahi to Istrich Kroile Miute. Blowing a shofar is not a biblically forbidden activity that would require a verse to exclude it from the normal prohibition. Dasanya de Beis Shmuel, because in the yeshiva of Shmuel it was taught, the verse says, Kon meleches avodah lo sasu, you shall do no servile work. That's in the same chapter. That means work, things which are defined as avodah, which are creative activities and transformational activities. And this excludes, and he gives examples of blowing the shofar and removing bread from an oven where it was already baking, which are considered to be a skill and not a malacha. If they're not a malacha, they're permitted by biblical law, in which case what would be the problem of blowing anyway? So Rava asks two questions against the original formulation. One is, if the Torah prescribes blowing the shofar on Shabbos, how could you do it in the temple? And the second is, well, actually blowing the shofar is not a biblically prohibited activity anyway, so why does the Torah have anything to say about it? Ella Omer Rava, so in that case, what is the reason we don't blow shofar on Shabbos? Omer Rava. Rava says, Midoraisa Mishra, biblically it is indeed permitted to blow the shofar on Shabbos. V'Rabbanan hu degozer bei, and the rabbis made a ruling against it. Could a Rabbi, in accordance with the ruling of Rabbi de Omer Rabbi, because Rabbi said, Rabbi is always concerned about consequences. Hakol chayovim b'tekiyah shofar, everyone is obligated in blowing the shofar. But not everyone is expert. Every adult must hear the shofar. Men biblically, most women choose to hear the shofar, then there may not be a biblical mitzvah. But everyone has to listen to the shofar, but only a small minority of people are expert in the shofar. And so what's the concern? Since it's a public thing and there's a responsibility on a very small number of people to ensure the public discharge their responsibilities, we're really concerned, and it's only done occasionally, we're worried that a mitzvah is done only occasionally, and it's so important and so beloved that the shofar blower will be encouraged to carry it through a public domain, to discuss this with an expert, to come and speak to the rabbi or the expert, to learn how to do it, and end up transporting it through the street by 4 cubits, which is biblically prohibited. And that is why we don't shake the lulav when Sukkot falls on Shabbos like it does this year. We're worried you might carry it through the street. And the same reason Megillah. Now there's obviously differences because Megillah again is a skill, whereas lulav is done by everyone. But in the meantime, the actual reason is biblical law permits it, but the rabbis were very worried. And of course in a Beis-Din setting, there are much less concerns, more of that to come. Now, that is written, just to kind of put this in context, it might seem a bit far-fetched, but we have to have something what's called a low plug. Once we have a ruling, we can't do it anywhere. So the fact there might be an eruv, the fact that you might be housebound, none of these will allow it. We have to have a blanket rule for the whole community. Either everyone blows or no one blows, and the ruling is that no one blows, as we will see. I think what comes out of this is an interesting psychological point, which I hadn't really appreciated until I did the research for this shiur, which is there's a recognition that while Shabbos, of course, is extremely important, there's a point at which an expert on whom the community relies will feel such a weight of responsibility and such enthusiasm and such a sense that he may be disappointing hundreds of people, that he may end up being lax and transporting the shofar inappropriately, and therefore we can't countenance this because Shabbos is more important. So that's the origin of the Gezerah. It is not learnt from the distinction in the Torah, because that doesn't work. It's a rabbinic enactment. Now, here are two paragraphs from the Gemara which we need for our further study. Mishachor of Beis HaMikdash, it's the second paragraph in the Gemara, the third paragraph in source 1. Mishachor of Beis HaMikdash, when the temple was destroyed, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted you could blow the shofar wherever there is a Beis Din. Tomer Rabban, the rabbis taught, Hamachas Chol Rosh HaShanah Liyos b'Shabbos. There was one occasion when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos. V'Kola Orim Miskansim, and all the local villages all came together, presumably to hear the shofar. And they're waiting for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai himself, who enacted this rule to blow the shofar. Omalohem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Bnei Beseira. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instructed Bnei Beseira, presumably they were the Balei Tokeya, they were the people who knew how to blow. Niskar, let's blow. Omruloi Nidon, they said to him, no. Let's work out first whether it's permissible. Let's adjudicate the rule, and then he said, and Omalohem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a man after my own heart. Kavan Nishma Keren B'Yavna. We've already heard the sound in Yavna, or the Keren B'Yavna. The horn has been blown in Yavna, and we don't worry. We don't ask questions after the fact. Omri Beloza. So he's basically saying, why don't you blow? I'm sorry, I've missed out a line. Omolahem Niska, the fourth line in this paragraph. So let me go back. Omolahem, he said to them, Niska v'achkach nidon. Man after my own heart, that's what I was trying to say. He said, no, let's blow and ask questions afterwards. La'achash t'tok u'omuloi nidon. After they had blown, they said to him, okay, now let's discuss the matter. Omolahem, he said to them, no, kavar nishma keren b'Yavna. We've already heard the shofar in Yavna. They meshivin la'achamaisa. And we're not going to respond. We're not going to start looking into it. So he outwits them, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai blows the shofar on Shabbos, and they're not in Jerusalem. He, as you know, he demurs. You can see he quotes the Mishnah, Gemara quotes the Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said this ruling was made only in Yavna. Omrulai, they said to him, this is still citing the Mishnah, Echad Yavna ve'echad kol mokum sheish bo beis din. No, their view is it's Yavna, and anywhere there's a beis din. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was actually much more flexible. Omrulo hayin tanakam, but that's the same as the first view. It could be known day beis and akroy. So the difference between the two views would be an ad hoc beis din. When this says a beis din, it means a fixed beis din, which is there all the time. But could you just convene a beis din, which can be done very easily? That wouldn't work. Now, the final paragraph from the Gemara, from which we need to extract a few rules before we look into the medieval sources and see what actually happens in practice. Omruloi, so he said. They said to him, we've seen this already, it's been quoted, the students said to Rebbe Loza, no, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling is you could blow the shofar on Rosh HaShanah wherever there was a beis din, not just in Yavna. Omer Rav Huna said, the im beis din, and with a beis din, says the Gemara, my im beis din. What does and with a beis din mean? Answer before the court. You can't just blow in a place where there happens to be a beis din. London there is a beis din, but it's not sitting. It has to be in front of the beis din. You would only blow when in the presence of the beis din. To exclude not in the presence of the beis din where you couldn't do it. Massive Rova bounced the following question. Didn't we say, and furthermore, Yerushalayim was superior to Yavna because all the little villages that could hear and see could come along. And also this. Why say that? If you say it because, in this regard, with the there's an additional factor. In beis din, it's got to be present in the beis din. That makes sense. Rather, in Yerushalayim, individuals could blow even without a beis din. But Yavna, it was restricted to, there's something special about the Yerushalayim, even individuals could do it because it was a place of the beis din, but in Yavna it had to be actually in the presence of the beis din. But is that really true that in Yavna individuals can't blow? V'haki also Rav Yitzchok bar Yosef Omar, ki masayim shalicha di tzipura tekir b'Yavna. But Rav Yitzchok Beni Bar Yosef said, when the chazan, here it means the tokeh, the person blowing, completed the tekiyas in the shul in Yavna, lo shama inish kol unya mikol tu koidi chidi. People would pick up their own shofars and they just do their own thing, freestyle. We've come across this before. And like people couldn't hear that, so you can see individuals did blow. Ella love, no, that's not the right distinction. Debi Yerushalayim tokin ben bizman basin, ben shaloi bizman basin. What it means in Yerushalayim, you can blow whether the basin is in session or not. Ubi Yavna, and in Yavna, bizman basin, in shaloi bizman basin lo. You can blow when the basin's in session, but not. So there are more restrictions in Yavna. Ha bizman basin, second column, mia token, vai shaloi b'fnei basin. But that implied you can blow when the basin is in session, even if you're not in front of the basin. If I know the basin is in session between 10 and 11 in the morning, I can blow in my shul even when the basin is not present. Lie, no! De'ila b'Yerushalayim token b'fnei, ben b'fnei basin, sho b'fnei basin, or b'yavna b'fnei basin, in shlo b'fnei basin. No, again, in Yerushalayim you could blow in the basin, not in its presence, and in Yavna only in the presence of the basin. Then I missed out a bit, and I'm going to summarise in a moment. The sugya was simply too long to include completely. Itmanami, it was taught as well. Omer Rebbe Chia bar Gamda Omer Rebbe Yosi bar Shaul Omer Rebbe. Ein token ela kolzman shabasin yoshvin. You only blow when the basin is actually sitting. And then it goes on to discuss an obscure case. What if they're kind of packing up their books and wrapping up their garments ready to leave? Is that in or out? Those are sort of obscure questions the Gemara addresses at the edge. What comes out of this is a disagreement in the Mishnah as to what happened after the destruction of the temple. Is it everywhere there's a basin or only in Yavna? And even if you hold that it's permitted, is it when the basin's in session? We haven't discussed what type of basin. Is it in the presence of the basin? Or only in a place where there is a basin? Or does it have to be when the basin's in session, but you can do it when the basin is not present, i.e. as long as you know it's at the time when the basin's functioning? Presumably that creates a certain awe on behalf of the community. There are a number of details that are unclear in this sugya. We move now into the second part, that's the kind of introduction. We now look at the way the Rambam codifies it, and he's very, very clear. In the second chapter of Hilchos Shofar Sukkah and Lulav, Halachas Vov, Ches and Tes, which is source 2 on your source sheet. Yom Tov Shel Rosh HaShanah Shechal Yos B'Shabbos. The Yom Tov of Rosh HaShanah, which falls on Shabbos, Ein Tokin B'Shofar B'Chol Mokom. One blows the shofar in no place. Afal Pisha Tekiya Mishum Shavus, even though blowing the shofar is a rabbinic prohibition, means it accepts Rava's opinion from the Gemara. Umin Adin Haisha Tokin, and really biblical law would allow one to blow. Yovai Asei Shal Torah, V'yidche Shvush Shel Divreihem. Let the biblical positive requirement to observe Shabbos come and push away the rabbinic law. Well, you'd say that. That was what you would say. Well, there's a biblical rule to blow the shofar and a rabbinic prohibition of blowing the shofar. Obviously, the biblical law wins out. V'lama ein tokin. So then, why do they not blow? I hope that wasn't. Maybe I just repeat it. I'm not sure how clear that was. The Rambam says, since it is only rabbinically forbidden, why do the rabbis say? After all, wouldn't you say the biblical mitzvah to blow the shofar should override the rabbinical mitzvah of blowing an instrument? Answer, why then did they make this rule? Slightly different from the Gemara. The rabbis made a ruling. Perhaps the person will carry it in hand and transport it to someone who will blow on his behalf. So excited by the mitzvah, one will end up transporting the shofar to someone who can blow it. And transport it 4 cubits in the public thoroughfare, and will all transport it from one domain to another, and come to a severe biblical prohibition. Because everyone is obliged to blow, but not everyone is expert in the act of blowing. The next rule, when the rabbis made this rule, and this is getting to the details, when the rabbis enacted not to blow on Shabbos, they made this rule only in the place where there is no based in. But when the temple stood, now the Rambam defines what is based in. It doesn't mean 3 dayanim who deal with current issues like a financial dispute or arranging a get. It means the based in the great court the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, when the Sanhedrin was present. Otherwise, it has no relationship to the Mikdash. That's I understand why the Rambam does this. Everyone would blow in Jerusalem as long as the Beis Din were in session, even not in their presence. But in the rest of the cities of Israel, they did not blow. But today, now that the temple has been destroyed, that Kol Mokum Sheyesh Bo Beis Din Kovua, for who Sheyesh Somuch Beretz Yisrael Token Bo B'Shabbos. What's whenever there's a fixed Beis Din, and that means they have to have traditional smicha, not the smicha that I have, which is effectively a certification of competence in certain areas of halacha and probably incompetence in other areas of halacha, but the smicha of laying on hands, which was passed from Moshe to Yeshua and to the subsequent generations. We don't have that today. And in the land of Israel, only such places where a basin is constituted in that way would they blow the shofar on Shabbos. Vein tokim b'Shabbos el basin shekitchu es hachodesh, and you can only blow on Shabbos in the basin that has the power to sanctify the moon, meaning to declare the moon the new month, based on visual testimony. Aval Shabbat edinim, but in other courts, ein tokim bahem, there is no shofar. Afal pi shehein samuchim, even if they are samuchim, even if they do have that special type of ordination, vein tokin ela bifnei basin bilvad, they only blow in the presence of the Beis Din. Kol zaman shehein shofar, while they are in session. V'lama tokim bifnei basin, explaining why the Beis Din is a significant factor. I mentioned it before. Why do they blow before the Beis Din? Because the Beis Din are very particular, very scrupulous. And people are not going to come and bring the shofar, have the audacity to bring the shofar through the street in front of the Beis Din, because the Beis Din will warn the people and inform them of the prohibitions. It's to regulate it. But according to the Rambam, it would have to be Dayanim who had smicha in a town in Eretz Yisrael, where they had the capacity to sanctify the moon based on visual testimony. This hasn't happened for many centuries, not at least probably for the last 1500 years. That is the Rambam's presentation, and that defines pretty much what we know to be normative practice. There is nowhere in the world at all that blows shofar on Rosh HaShanah when it falls on Shabbos, as far as we know. However, it is not as simple as this. Introducing the Rif Rav Al-Fassi, the great pre-Maimonidean code, which is characterized by one important feature that I need to explain. The Rif, unlike the Rambam, removes from his code all laws that are not relevant in the non-temple era. So anything which is temple focus is out, unlike the Rambam, and the laws he codes he believes to be laws that are relevant and applicable in the post-temple era. So here it says the Rif. And what the Rif does is that he effectively paraphrases the Gemara. That's how he presents his laws. Here is the Rif. Omer Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, V'im Beis Din, remember this, it's quoted from the bottom of the Gemara, which we saw on the bottom of the first column. V'im Beis Din, remember Rav Huna qualified it, and with the Beis Din. My V'im Beis Din, what's with the Beis Din? Bifnei Beis Din must be in the presence of the Beis Din. Afuki shaloi bifnei Beis Din deloi, to exclude the prospect of blowing the shofar without a Beis Din present, where you not in the presence of a Beis Din where you can't. Itmanami, it was also taught, Omer Rebbe Chia bar Gamda Omer Rebbe Yosef ben Shor Omer Rebbe, Ein token ella kol zaman shebeis din yoshvin. You only blow when the Beis Din is sitting. Notice that the Rif, first of all, includes this in his code for the post-temple legislation. He does not mention what type of Beis Din. He does not mention smuchim, people with the classical ancient smicha. He does not mention that they are in the land of Israel. And he does not mention the fact that they have to have the capacity to sanctify the new month. None of those are present in the Rif's code. But the most important thing, which you'll see the Run, a super commentary on the Rif, mentions, is the very fact that the Rif included this. V'nira meha Rav Al-Fassi zal, that's his name, Rav Al-Fassi, that's the Rif. You can see from the writings of the Rif, Shehevi Meimrus Hololu Bahalochis, that he cites these Talmudic statements in his halachic code, Shehu Soiva de Lobo Eden Basin Somuch, that you do not need a Beis Din of classically ordained people. Venerish Kikul Lo McCain, he feels compelled to do so, it seems. Mida Amrina Begomora, Omro Hainatana Kam Ikibin M Beidin Adakroy. Remember, at the bottom of the third paragraph, we concluded so what the real difference was. A a Beis Din Akrai. The real issue, if you read that Gemara, was not doing it in front of a hastily or ad hoc constituted Beis Din. For Rabbi Eliezer Sova, the low ticker Rabbi Yom Yochim said, "Edumi the Beis HaMikdash, Haina Beis HaVad, Shiyod B'Kavir de Yarcho." But it's Rabbi Elazar who has much more street. It's got to be a basin of a sort that could exist in the temple, that it has a special place, that it's capable of fixing the months, and so on and so forth. And then V'shom Tokim Bifnei Gimel. It would have to be in front of 3 of the Beis Din who had the capacity to determine the months, and so on and so forth. And he goes on to explain that the Rif effectively believes that the stipulations are very few. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's view, he adopts not Rebbe Lozer's stringent reading, but the first reading, that the real concern is that it has to be when the Beis is in session. It has to be a fixed Beis Din. It has to be in front of the Beis Din. But if you had those conditions, it's a town where there is a permanent fixed Beis Din that sits regularly. And the Beis Din is in session, and you do it in front of the Beis Din, it will be permissible everywhere. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted after the temple was destroyed. Lefichach, if you turn onto the second sheet, the second line of the first column, Ulefichach, and therefore, Kosov Harif Zal, Behilichosov, Hard Rav Huna, V'im Beis Din Bifnei Beis Din. This is why, and I've missed out a little of his reasoning, this is why the Rif incorporates these laws in his halachic code, and he mentions this, that it must be in front of a Beis Din, but that's all, as long as it's a real Beis Din that sits on a regular basis, and it's in session and it's in front of them. Va'al, look at this is the good bit, Va'al zeh hoya soymech la'asos ma'aser b'dover, and on this, the Rif himself relied to perform in accordance with his understanding. Shatokim beveis dinoi b'Rosh HaShanah shechal yes b'Shabbos. They blew the shofar in his Beis Din when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos. It's completely different from the Rambam. And in terms of Rosh HaShanah, this is maybe the most famous disagreement between the Rambam and almost all other sources on one side and the Rif. Now, the Baal HaMaor, Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, argues with the Rif. Source 5, the Rif should never have written this at all. If he's writing laws that are germane to the post-temple era, why would you write this? When it says Beis Din, it doesn't mean 3 guys who adjudicate financial issues or who deliver gittin. It doesn't mean that. It means the Sanhedrin. A Sanhedrin Gedolah, that's 71, or the Sanhedrin Katana, that's of 23. Va'achshav, after the ellipses in the third line of source 5, Va'achshav ein lonu Sanhedrin, lo gedolah, we need to have the large or small Sanhedrin, the ein shemokim b'Yisrael shetokim boy, beyond the Rosh HaShanah shechal yes b'Shabbos, and there's nowhere in the entire Jewish people who blow the shofar when Rosh HaShanah falls on Shabbos. And we have a couple of more sources here, also Rishonim, the Sefer HaManoach. Sefer HaManoach is a super commentary on the Rambam. Omar Mafarish loish kachan duchte ba'olam shetokim bo b'yom tov shel Rosh HaShanah b'Shabbos. The explanator, that's how he refers to himself, says there's not a place in the world where they blow the shofar when Rosh HaShanah falls on Shabbos, just like the Baal HaMaor in the previous source. Miu midina de Gemara hachi mashma k'moshe kosav harav. But actually, it does appear that the reading that it should be permitted is the right one. V'chem hiskem harif v'chem kosav harav bal ha'ezer. And as the Rif writes, and we saw the Rif already in source 3, and we saw the run explaining the Rif in source 4, and the Rif also hold like the Baal HaEzer, I don't know who the Baal HaEzer is, but another medieval source who concurs with the Rif's opinion. He reports that he saw a sage who came from Damascus, Shurah, who himself had seen Shotokim beyond Rosh HaShanah b'Shabbos, that he blew the shofar, they'd blown the shofar in Damascus when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos, presumably in accordance with the opinion of the Rif, who himself came from North Africa and influenced the halachic practices very much of that world. Now, I think to avoid the shiur being too long, I'm going to miss source 7 with the Mechemes Hashem of the Ramban. So the Ramban goes into battle, and he is of the view that the Baal HaMaor is wrong and the Rif is probably right. However, what he says is that while it's true that the Rif held like this, his students did not follow in his footsteps. They were nervous about this, and people argued with the Rif, and perhaps no one properly understood him, But if you just go to the penultimate line, 3 words from the end, Mikol Mokum lo soncho olam al zeh ve'ein mokum ba'olam v'shisku. No one ended up relying on this Rif, and this practice appears to have died with him, because there's nowhere in the world, not even amongst the students of the Rif, who followed this opinion, this reading, because there are clearly 2 different ways to read the Gemara. And the Ritva, a little later, also says much the same thing, and I'm going to leave that out. Now, the story doesn't quite end there, because there have been occasions in Jewish history, most notably with Rav Schlesinger, it's around 100 years ago, who was absolutely convinced that now the Jews had returned to the land. He was a kind of proto-Zionist. He went to live in Eretz Yisrael, pre-state, that you could convene a Beis Din, and there was a lot of argument and discussion and attempts to garner rabbinic support. And there are even claims that this Schlesinger, behind closed doors, blew shofar in front of a Beis Din when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos, and there were various conversations going on around it. This is discussed in great detail in a very interesting article that you can find online, written around the last year when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos, which is in 2009. It's called Shofar Sounding on Shabbos by Belovski and Greenspan, published originally in Mishpacha magazine, but available online. And he tells the story of Schlesinger, but there are 2 things with which to finish. They say in this article, the history of shofar blowing on Shabbos recently became even more interesting and intriguing with the publication in 1985 of a newly discovered, startling piyut liturgical poem for Rosh HaShanah. Found in the Cairo Geniza, this liturgical poem is enigmatic, but seems to indicate that at the time it was recited, Jews did blow shofar on Shabbos in the presence of the Beis Din, i.e. following the Pesach of the Rif. However, instead of being held, and this introduced a fascinating spin, the shofar was tied to a pillar in the synagogue, and the blower merely put his mouth to it and blew. Of course, this obviates the entire problem. Tie it to a pillar, and what was the concern? You might take it in the street and transport it to another domain or through the street. You can't. It's physically impossible. Of course, it still allows the possibility that someone will take a different shofar, but it does convey a very stark message. It's not like the Rif. There's no record of the Rif doing this. The Rif did not believe it was necessary. The presence of the Beis Din would regulate people's behaviour and avert the concern people might transport it inadvertently. But in the meantime, this was a sort of compromise. The date and provenance, I think, of the piyut are uncertain, but it seems to be describing a custom in the land of Israel up until the 12th century. Now, the 12th century postdates the Rif by a couple of 100 years. Now, to finish, Greenspan and Belovski, in their article, produce a little picture. It's fascinating, and I'm delighted to have managed to include it. Probably some copyright issues here. If you look very closely at the picture, you will see that this shofar has rope or string tied round it, a few inches from the mouthpiece. And the legend says shofar from Bulgaria with string wrapped around it. And there is good reason to believe that there may have been other communities, perhaps in Bulgaria, which had many customs adopted from Sephardi communities, and many Sephardim lived in Bulgaria, that they followed the Pesach of the Rif, possibly even into quite modern times. And the way they somehow reconcile themselves to the fact that the Rambam and most other poskim reject it is that this string was probably used to tie the shofar to a pillar, or a bench of some sort in the shul, and the shofar would only be blown by someone who was putting his mouth to a shofar that in fact couldn't be moved from its place. And so the discussion about blowing shofar on Shabbos is not straightforward, and it's likely, in fact we know for sure, that the Rif in his Beis Din blew when Rosh HaShanah fell on Shabbos, and there have probably been pockets of practice, perhaps even to quite modern times, who have done so, and even attempts to revive this practice as recent as 100 years ago. Be as it may, our practice is not to blow shofar on Shabbos. We treat the Shabbos as zichron teruah, a remembrance, and we adapt the prayers accordingly, and we look forward to blowing the shofar on the second day, Sunday. Thank you.